chance to kind of show you what I do. I've been working for this company for about 22 years. I started out with them as an intern. I had just graduated my master's program that I started at 40 after partying for about 20 years. Why don't I just jump into, let me just say one other thing, that a lot of what I'm going to show you is right in line with smart recovery, with cognitive behavioral therapy. There may be some stuff that is not in line with it exactly, or maybe in line with other programs that you go to, but just kind of try to bear with it, and I would advise to not get hung up in the semantics, because we're all really talking about the same thing. So I want to start out with the human brain, and that large top of the brain, the cerebral cortex. We have the largest brain relative to our size in the animal kingdom. There are a couple of animals that have a bigger brain. Elephants, whales, but they're huge. Relative to our size and weight, we have the largest brain. And that's our thinking brain. It's what we use for logical, rational decision making. It's what directs our conscious behavior. It's been a tremendous asset in our evolution. It's put us at the top of the food chain. You know, we're not as big as many animals, we're not as fast, we're not as strong, we don't have giant fangs or teeth, but we have this large brain. There's no other animal that systematically kills, processes, and eats humans, although human beings around this planet probably pretty much systematically process and eat every other animal. So this thinking brain gave us a huge edge. Intelligence, the ability to create tools, weapons to work together. So it's given us a huge survival edge. Now, not every mammal has a large cortex. In some mammals it's really tiny, almost non-existent. But every mammal, including us, has a very highly developed lower brain. The lower brain, it's known technically as the limbic brain. You can call it the lower brain, the primitive brain, the addicted part of the brain. It's implicated in every form, to some degree, in every form of chemical or behavioral addictions and compulsions, compulsive behavior. And it's also a huge plus in our evolution, in our survival as a species and as individuals. But it doesn't work in the same way as the thinking brain. What your limbic brain does is it rewards you for doing pro-survival activity. And the way it rewards you is by releasing neurotransmitters, chemicals, brain chemicals, and the one that is most implicated is dopamine. So when you do certain things, it's going to make you feel good. So you'll want to do that again. So for example, when you have sex, it's your lower brain that lets you know that you had a good time. So you'll want to have sex again. And why would we want to have sex other than it feels good? What's the reason for having sex?
Reproduce.
Procreation, right. We reproduce. It's the only way we can have others of our kind. When you eat a meal, that good feeling you get after you eat is your brain releasing dopamine. It releases these chemicals through these channels called the pleasure centers. They're networks of cells that are set up to receive the chemical. And so you feel good when you eat. You feel good after if you're thirsty and you drink some water. Why? Because we need to eat to function. We need to drink water to function, and all those kind of things. When you do something really well, you know, like you make a big sale and you get a good commission, you get a good grade on a test, you do well in an athletic event, you know that pumped up feeling you get? Like, wow, I really nailed that. You know, you do a good job, you feel good about that. That's your brain releasing dopamine. So you could make an argument that biologically human beings are primed to want to learn and to want to succeed and to want to do things well. And the reason for that probably goes back to, you know, older times when all humans lived in very small groups and bands and tribes. It wasn't that long ago. It's only been 10,000 years since the city-state evolved. So those those who could learn how to hunt and survive in a very hostile environment got to live longer, have more children, and pass down more of their DNA. So it's a huge survival thing, this need to want to do things well. Now this lower brain does all of this unconsciously. It does not control your conscious behavior. So what happens as people use over time, as they use chemicals, psychotropic chemicals, alcohol and drugs, over time, your brain chemistry starts to change, and this can happen really slow. You're not aware it's happening while it's going on. Where your higher functioning brain, your cortical brain, starts to go offline and you start to do dumb shit and stupid things and hurt people or whatever. And your lower brain, which is not supposed to be directing your behavior, is now causing you to seek out the chemical, to use it, to recover, to hide, all of that kind of stuff. So this brain chemistry reversal starts to happen very slowly over time without you being aware that it's going on, and ultimately without you knowing that your brain chemistry has changed over time. So, things trigger the brain to want to use chemicals or to engage in compulsive behaviors. And this is a more of a technical definition of a trigger, which is that it is a stimulus which has been repeatedly associated with the preparation for, the anticipation of, or the use of drugs or alcohol. And these stimuli include people, things, places, times of day. Those are external triggers, as well as emotional states, which you can call internal triggers. So another big part of this whole story is Pavlov, and I'm sure that most of us are familiar with Pavlov's work. He was a Russian scientist. He lived about 100 years ago. He did a famous experiment with dogs. We were talking about a little bit about dogs, about cats and dogs, and the experiment that Pavlov did with dogs is that he fed dogs and he rang the bell. The dogs would see the food and they would smell the food and they would start to salivate and to produce gastric fluid in anticipation for eating. That's something that happens to all mammals, including human beings, especially when you're hungry. When you're around food, your body starts to unconsciously prepare for digestion in anticipation for eating. So he did this hundreds of times with these dogs. Fed them, rang a bell. Then one day he comes to the lab, doesn't bring any food with him at all. So there's no food, there's no smell of food, there's no visual of food, and he just rings the bell. What happened to all those dogs? They start to drool. Okay, they can't help it at that point. If you had just rung the bell before you connected it to the food, would it have any meaning to the dogs? No. They would hear a bell, but it would not have the same kind of meaning. Now, when they hear the bell, it means they're going to get fed. And here's the kicker. No matter how smart, no matter how well trained that dog is, you cannot command it at this point, when I ring this bell, I don't want you to drool. It can't help it. So what happens if you look at addiction is that the bell for human beings are people, places, things, times of day that have been historically associated with the use of drugs or alcohol. So if you're around those people, if you're in those places, if you're in that certain frame of mind that you used to drink around, your brain starts to produce dopamine, even though you haven't used yet. We're not talking about a metaphorical high. You're literally getting high just by being around the circumstances or having certain feelings that have been connected up with using, good or bad feelings.
Or what happened was in the last month with this thing, I stopped working out in the morning.
Yeah.
I wasn't getting what I would get as my high in the morning
Right.
working out. And I came home and I was tired and I just wanted to get, wanted to get the hell out. I'm not making it right, I'm just saying that is what went on with me. And I drove and I consciously looked at it, drove around, looked at the other bars and said, I don't want to be there.
Let me tell you something else that might be helpful in light of what just happened to you. That little trickle of dopamine can quickly become a cascade. The scientists call it a cascade, a flood of dopamine. By the time it's in a flood of dopamine, you're in craving mode. That's what craving is, and you may not be able.
I hadn't felt that in 7 months. It's just-
One is, I don't mean you specifically, one is, even though you know this isn't a good idea, at this point it might be too late to stop it, because the process has gone too far.
Oh, jeez. Thanks for the humor.
Okay. Here's another really interesting thing. A lot of people really take a lot away from this, especially family members of people that are having addiction problems. If any one of us went outside there and captured a mouse, a wild Sarasota mouse that has never used drugs or alcohol, and never has any intention or even knows what it is, and we put it in a box, and the mouse could go into two places. It can escape and go through a tunnel and go into a dark place, or escape and go into a tunnel and go to a brightly lit place. Where's that mouse going to go? Every single time. The dark. Why? You're right. Why in the dark?
I have no idea.
For safety. The brains of mice and other rodents are programmed to instinctively seek out the dark, because it lessens the probability that they will get eaten by another animal or killed by a human being or maimed. It's automatic, it's instinctive, they don't think about it, they just go for the dark. Now, it doesn't help them 100% because lots of other animals can hunt really well in the dark. But it does give them a little bit of an edge. It helps with the survival of mice as a species and as individual creatures. So a normal mouse would always go into the dark. What if in this experiment you forced the mouse into the light and you gave it a very, very small amounts of cocaine? When given the option now to go into the dark or the light, where's the mouse going to go?
It's going to go where it got the stimulus, the kick.
It's going to go to the cocaine. This is
Against
very,
its own survival
this is
mode.
very self-destructive, insane behavior in the mouse universe. The mouse now sees the cocaine reward, and now I'm speaking a little metaphorically, as being more important than staying alive and not getting crippled.
Yeah.
It's more valuable to the mouse's brain because the mouse's brain chemistry has been changed. When you talk about this to a bunch of people in recovery, particularly early recovery, who don't have these awarenesses of these things, it clicks into place. Okay, so that's why I spent all the money that I was putting aside for my kids' food and the rent. That's why I did this. It helps the family members understand too, so they don't see it as a moral issue so much that, oh, well, you love drugs more than me, or you're an evil person, how could you do this? And I'm not saying that everything you do is right. I mean, I think we have to take some responsibility, but at least it gives family members and the people themselves a feeling that, hey, I'm not insane, I'm not crazy, I'm not an evil person. What happened was I changed my brain chemistry over time without being aware of it. And that can be a huge, to take off some of that shame and guilt can be a huge help to get someone invested in recovery. Because usually by the time, and certainly this was my experience, I wouldn't be surprised if it was everyone's experience in this room, by the time you're ready to go to a meeting, by the time you're ready to show up at a treatment center, you're usually thinking, you know what, I am just such a bad person. I have a bad character, I'm evil, I'm crazy, I must be sick, how could I have done all those things? That's not me. But this kind of gives people the beginning of an understanding of, why they did some of the stuff they did. And that it's not, no, you're not a bad person, but let me tell you what I think happened to your brain chemistry over time so you'll have an understanding. So in the beginning, when people first start using drugs, AOD stands for alcohol or other drugs, there's a huge positive benefit, okay? Depending on what you're using, the benefit might be you're getting a relief from depression, you're getting a relief from anxiety or loneliness. Some drugs help you sleep better. Most of them have a sense of well-being, a euphoria. You may have increased status with your peers. You may have more energy with some drugs. You may have increased sexual or social confidence, with alcohol or with pot or with cocaine or with a combination of them. You may be able to work better if you're using stimulants. You may be able to think more clearly if you're using certain drugs. Now, there are negative aspects in the beginning as well. Maybe what you're doing is illegal, maybe it's expensive, you might feel hungover, feel ill, maybe you'll miss work or school, maybe not. But all in all, you've had a really positive experience in the beginning. Human behavior does not happen in a vacuum. Research shows that people who get killer hangovers, where you're sick for days, typically have less chance of becoming alcoholic than people who don't get hangovers or can handle a hangover pretty well. Okay? So let's talk about some hypothetical situations and how an addiction might start, or how problems with drugs or alcohol may start. Let's start with a 17-year-old male in high school, junior or senior. Uses pot, drinks beer, doesn't use hard drugs yet. Okay? Is this common in our culture? Extremely common. He doesn't use hard drugs yet, but he knows other kids at his school that do. That's also really common. Okay? Why doesn't he use hard drugs? What might be some of the reasons why he doesn't use meth or heroin or cocaine?
He doesn't need them yet.
Doesn't need them yet.
Just socially trained. I was just socially trained. Hey, you go to a bar, wine and beer is okay. Socially, wine and beer was okay.
And
Availability. Maybe he's seen some of those ads. Maybe he's a jock on the team and he doesn't want to use it. Okay, he goes to a party on a Saturday night. He's had a couple of beers. He's smoked a little pot. He's sitting on the couch watching the other kids. He's kind of, just observing them, just chilling. Doesn't feel like left out or anything, but he's just kind of watching and observing. And he knows that there's some kids at this party in one of the back rooms who are doing meth or speed or heroin or cocaine or pills or whatever. The door opens up and his best friend, one of his best friends, comes out with a plate that has lines on it and says, "Hey, you should try some of this, it's really good." And in that moment he does. Why now? My question to you.
Best friend and lower inhibitions.
Lower inhibitions,
Yeah.
a little high.
Judgment is
Good
gone.
friend. You could even say that in our culture, we kind of value experimentation. That's the culture we live in. You could even say this might have happened sooner or later anyway, certainly
Right.
maybe in today's age. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's say what's on the plate is meth or cocaine. Within seconds, he's like this. Whoa. Okay, not everyone has this response to stimulants, but most people do. Okay, the first time. And almost instantaneously, he's feeling handsomer, wittier, stronger, better, taller. Before he was just watching the other kids. Now he's in a mix. He's cracking jokes because, speed makes you, motor mouth. He's getting all kinds of props, slaps on the back and everything. He's never had so much fun. He's never felt so good in his life. Next day, Sunday, he stays up really late. He kind of sleeps it off. Monday morning, he's back at school. No worse for wear. What happened tonight? What happened over the weekend?
His brain had a total different chemical reaction to something, and now he got a pleasure response, and now there's an association. And
Yes.
he wants to go get that feeling again.
Yes. He
Whether it's
had
into
he had a huge response with no consequences.
Oh, yeah, that's how that started.
He has a
with me.
great memory of the situation.
Yeah.
He might even say to himself, I wasn't even late to school today.
Yeah.
Maybe those adults are trying to take everything away from kids that we like, just like they do with herb, which is a common thing that kids say today, right? So now he has a memory. Is he addicted yet?
Yes, absolutely.
I would say, and we could get into the semantics of this. I would say technically no. He's not addicted the way it's defined in the DSM. Okay, he doesn't have dependency. He doesn't have the criteria for it. Okay, but what he does have is a memory And he does have, boy, that was really fun, I wouldn't mind doing that again. Okay, let me go on with this. So in terms of being in this beginning phase, this recreational phase, there are no triggers yet. The connection, that associated connection, that Pavlovian connection is mild. And the responses are, he has pleasant thoughts about the experience. He does have a physiological response, but only after he uses, and his using is infrequent, it's random, it's not anticipated. Sometimes, like that night, he just came across it. And this is pretty much how everyone starts. People who become addicted and people who won't. Remember, that really intensive physiological addiction is at the end of the continuum. It takes a while to get there. So, in terms of the craving response, it's really simple. You go to where the drugs are at this stage, you use, and then you have a response. The effects. And the effects might be a change in your heart or pulse rate, depending on whether you use stimulants or depressants. And by the way, alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, although it often feels like a stimulant at first. Respiration might change, energy levels might change, and other physiological things. And in terms of what's going on in his life, all the typical usual things, and AOD, I went to that party, and I had a great time, and there's another party in 3 weeks, and I hope my buddy Joe is there again and has some more of that stuff with him, because I really liked it. By the way, another hypothetical situation that I didn't go over from the other slide was, in an older person, how it might start in an older person. So instead of being in high school, let's say it's someone who's 20 years older, and a guy in his 30s who works in the trades. And he's a framer, a house framer. And he's been framing a house in the middle of the heat wave. It's been 95 degrees every day this week. And here it is Thursday morning, and it's not even 10 o'clock yet, and he's completely spent. He's, starting to feel the work. It's very intense physical work in his joints, his back, and he's thinking, boy, I don't know how I'm going to get through the next 2 days of this. I can't afford to lose this job. And one of his co-workers notices this, and during the break at 10 o'clock gives him a little bit of cocaine and says, hey, this stuff will get you through the rest of the day. And he bangs out through the rest of the day. His foreman comes to him at the end of the day and says, boy, you know what? You're the best worker I ever had. You consistently produce for me. I'm going to give you a raise and make you head of the crew. Without knowing that he, used some cocaine. And now this guy might think, hey, whatever that stuff is, it's gold. You could translate that in many different ways, particularly today when people are really desperate to keep their jobs. It could be a truck driver. It could be someone who has to work a graveyard shift. Often people start using because of someone who has to, work doubles or triple shifts. Or it could be a young mother with 3 kids under the age of 8 who has to work part-time or full-time. Also has to bring these kids to all their activities, feels responsible for keeping the house clean, having dinner on a table, and feels completely overwhelmed until one of the girlfriends turns her on to speed. And now not only is she getting everything done, but she's keeping her weight down. The point I'm trying to make with these examples is that people often start to use because it works for them in what they perceive to be a positive way in the beginning. So as you move along, now the scales are still tipped in a positive. So you're still getting a relief of depression, a boost of confidence, relief of boredom. The drugs or the alcohol may still be working for you socially or sexually. But now there's more negative effects. And now and these are hard to see, so they're not easy to see at this stage. It might be the beginning of problems at work, the beginnings of relationship problems, the beginnings of financial issues, maybe the beginnings of physiological dependence with drugs like opiates or even alcohol. You might start to see some physiological dependence at this stage. So what's changing now in terms of brain chemistry is that as you get closer to the chemicals, you actually start to have the chemical effects. Now what this means is that your brain is starting to release dopamine, even though you're not using yet. And then of course you use and you have the full-on effects. And what's happening in terms of the person's life, they're still doing all the same, a lot of the same stuff, thinking about dinner and what's on TV, school, work, relationships, but more thoughts and issues around drugs or alcohol are starting to creep in. And then as you get to this next phase, what you see here is that the scales are tipped now in the negative. So while you're still getting maybe some social benefits, occasional euphoria, relief from feeling tired, relief from stress or other emotional states, on the negative side, you're starting to have some serious effects. You're starting to have DUIs, nosebleeds, infections, relationship disruption, family distress, impending job loss or suspension from school. Most people in our culture, most Americans and probably other Western cultures who get to this stage actually stop on their own or modify their using on their own. They don't go to treatment, they don't go to meetings, they say something to themselves like, you know what, I'm starting to experience some negative consequences around this, I'm going to change things up a little, I'm going to stop for a while, I'm going to change what I drink. 10 to 20%, and this is with alcohol, of people who start using alcohol are not going to be able to make those modifications or make those changes, that will probably fail at that. That's from the gate. If you look at the low end of that 10%, and it's estimated that 250 million people in this country use alcohol, that's 25 million people who from the gate are going to develop a problem with alcohol. It's huge, and that's in this country. What about countries like China that have 1.5 billion people, or India? This is a huge worldwide issue. So now that connection is really strong. Did I drive him away?
No, I think he went to the restaurant.
Okay. Every weekend's a trigger. Some of your friends, as you incorporated more people into your life who use, now all your friends use, the ones who don't use, they either dropped you or you dropped them. Anytime you're stressed or bored or anxious, anytime after work or lonely, you're starting to continually think about it. You're feeling a strong physiological arousal as you think about it. People develop psychological dependency, physical dependency, strong cravings, and frequent use. And just thinking about using can cause your brain to start releasing dopamine, which increases as you get closer, and then you have the full-on effects. And what we see typically is people's lives get smaller and smaller and smaller as the using issues start to crowd out all the normal issues in their lives. I had a friend, my friend Carl, we were all party animals, but Carl could party anyone under the table, and his dad had died of alcoholism and cirrhosis, and Carl started getting pulled over. Okay, and this is, we're talking 25, 30 years ago, more frequently as his drinking increased. And, he didn't want it, and that was back in the day when you got a slap on the wrist and you were let go a lot before MAD and any of that. But it still made him nervous. So what was his solution?
Get a
Sold
chauffeur.
his car. Sold his car. So now he had to, find a way to get to work by bus or by bike, or that he could walk to work. And he found a great job, was as a bartender down the street, which only increased his exposure to drugs and alcohol. So we see people's lives shrink to accommodate the growing addiction over time. And finally, there's the disaster phase. Now you're getting very little on the positive side. Maybe some relief from feeling tired, some relief from stress, some relief from depression. But on the negative side, and this is of course at the end of the continuum, you've got weight loss, anorexia, paranoia, psychosis, loss of family, seizures, heart attacks, strokes, severe depression, homicidality, suicidality, unemployment, bankruptcy. That condition response is overpowering. It's any emotion that triggers day, night, work, non-work. The responses are you're obsessively thinking about it all the time. The using is robotic. It's automatic. Often the only thing that will stop a binge is having a seizure, getting arrested, or literally having nothing left to trade or barter for the drugs. When I was doing my clinical work, and during the crack cocaine epidemic, I can't tell you how many different people came to me and told me the same story. I was in a crack house for 2 weeks, didn't know if it was day or night, and when I left without my pants or my shoes because I sold them for one last hit. And I heard this from dozens of people, and I thought, how horrific. You're in this dungeon for weeks, this dangerous place with, people with guns and crazy and insane, and you leave without your pants after that because you sold them for a final hit. I heard that from so many different people that I knew it had to be a real story that people were experiencing. So often at this phase, thinking about using the drugs, going to get the drugs, cop them, is qualitatively a better high than the using. The using for many people isn't even fun at this point. It's dysphoric. It's horrible with drugs like meth, which are really popular in Florida and other places. You might be using around the clock and the whole time you're doing this. The whole time you're using or taking apart every appliance in your house or picking at your face until it's a bloody mess. You're not having fun, but you can't stop. So something that started out as being fun and useful with little or no consequences, often, if you take it, project it all the way out, can become something that's so horrific. It's like your worst nightmare, only now you can't stop. You could control it in the beginning, and it was fun and useful, and down the line, it's horrible, only now you can't stop it. And that's all that's going on at this point. So for family members who tell me in my work, and they say, you know what, I'm really concerned about the quality of my relationship with my husband, with my wife, and they're at this point, I say, well, the reason you're not able to have a good quality relationship right now is because in many ways your spouse is not even behaving in a human-like way at this point. This is like the mouse that goes voluntarily into the light. That mouse is not behaving in a mouse-like way anymore. And that same similar kind of thing can happen to some human beings behind these chemicals. So that's the limbic brain. That's what's in the center of your head. It's not those colors. That's color-coded. We all have that. It might look a little different in each one of us, just like our eyes and nose and hair and height are all different. But that's what's implicated primarily in the addictive process from a physiological point of view. These are artist rendition because what's happening is at a molecular level. It's so tiny. It's even with the strongest electron microscope, it's hard to see what's happening. But everything we say, do, think, feel is related to transmission between cells. And we have about 100 billion neurons, and each one of our neurons connects to between 1 and 1,000 other neurons. So there's about 1 trillion connections in our brain. Our brains are really remarkable for being 2.5 pounds in terms of what they can do. There's a little space between each cell. It's called the synapse. And the way the transmission happens, the pathway it takes, is that these storage pouches are called vesicles. In this cell, they store the dopamine. The dopamine gets released, jumps into a receptor on the next cell next to it. It fits like a lock and key, which then stimulates this cell to release its dopamine to all the other thousands of cells around it. And that's the way the chain progresses. When the activity is over, the dopamine is sucked back up into this cell and restored in the pouches by these structures called dopamine transporters. They're like little vacuum cleaners or little pumps that restore it. So there's this constant movement of chemical back and forth between cells. It gets released and it gets restored. Now this is a very complex mechanism, and it happens in fractions of a second. So what happens when you throw chemicals into this mix? I mean, there are already hundreds of neurotransmitters involved. In the normal brain, what happens when you throw in alcohol or heroin or cocaine or meth or nicotine or caffeine or any of those things? Well, it jams things up. If you look at cocaine, the way cocaine works, you see the cocaine molecule very closely resembles the dopamine. And these are the transporters. So the cocaine blocks the transporters so that the dopamine molecules can't get sucked back up and restored. So what this means is that initially you have a lot more dopamine floating between your cells. So initially you're feeling with the stimulant is like, whoa, wow, that feels good, right? Over time, however, because it's not normal now, it's not a natural process, your own dopamine becomes toxic to you because it's not getting restored into the cell. The other thing that starts to happen is your brain wants to accommodate, because your brain is saying, hey, there's way too much dopamine here. We got to get rid of some of it. So you start losing receptors. They either retreat or just disappear, and with some chemicals they actually get destroyed. So now you have less receptors, which is why when people are in withdrawal, or even in that first year of recovery, they feel so shitty, is because they've got less, perhaps they have much less of the dopamine receptors or other receptors now in their brain, so they're not feeling the chemical high, and they're also not able to feel kind of a natural high from things like, exercise or playing with your kids or your dog or something like that. Which is why those first few months and those first few years can be so tricky for people. Because basically your brain has to heal. And, if you are relapsing or having a lot of chronic relapses, it's kind of like pulling the scab off, because the healing does happen. But guess what? It's a really slow process. That's what the research shows. It takes years for this healing to happen. Now that's cocaine. Cocaine comes from an organic source, the coca plant. It's refined, and it's pretty toxic, and it does some physical damage as well as just block the receptors and the transporters. But what about meth? Meth is all chemical. Everything about it is chemical. So meth not only plugs these up, but it destroys them. It destroys the vesicles, it rips open the cell walls, and you have huge amounts of dopamine flowing out. But that's because of actual tissue damage. All chemical drugs cause some tissue damage. It's important to remember that there's a physiological basis for what's going on. I mean, there are cultures that have been using coca plants for 4,000 years with little ill effect in the, South America, the Andes. It helps them live at, 12,000 feet and work with very poor diets. But it's a very mild form of cocaine. It's in the coca leaf. I'm not advocating for that, by the way, but it's just a fact. So these are normal brains. The red and yellow indicates normal brain metabolism. This is a cocaine abuser. This is 10 days after last using, and you read them going down. Look at how dark they are. This is 100 days after last using. So you see that it's over time, it's starting to look like that, but it's a long way to go. This is a really interesting study that was done by NIDA. Many different variations of this study. They had two groups of people that were wired up to PET scans or MRIs, and one group of people had never had any kind of drug problems. The other group were stimulant users who had really good recovery. They showed both groups videos of nature scenes, animals and trees and grass and flowers, and they measured their brain waves, and they both came out the same. Not brain waves, brain metabolism. They then switched the videos to videos of paraphernalia and people using. The non-users the non-using group, their brains registered the same way as when they were watching nature. So it was like their brains were saying, okay, I was looking out this window and I saw one type of scenery. Now I'm looking out this window and I see a whole other type of scenery, but my brain attaches no unusual significance to it. The recovering cocaine users, with really good recovery, some of them, their brains all lit up in the amygdala, which is a major structure in the lower brain. The amygdala is implicated in trauma. Okay, they say the amygdala never forgets. When a little kid touches a hot stove, a 2-year-old, they'll say that kid's never going to touch a hot stove again. That's imprinted in the amygdala. So what this means is that for a moment they were triggered. So what I take away from all of these studies, and there are dozens of them like this, is that if you're in recovery, it doesn't mean that you have to relapse, or that you have to be a chronic relapser. You may go the rest of your life without using it. Unfortunately, what it might mean, and what it probably does mean, is that the potential to relapse may always be there no matter what. This is a cut. The cut goes this way through the face of a user, and that's the amygdala. It's lit up. And this is a different MRI, functional MRI, going this way. The cut's this way, and that's the eye, and that's the nose, and that's the prefrontal cortex, which is a major part of the thinking brain. The blue indicates it's shut down. Okay.
That's the problem.
So what you have here is your using foot is jammed on the gas, and your brakes are gone. No brakes.
Yeah, you're
One of the
go.
functions of the prefrontal cortex is impulse control.
Yeah.
It's knowing the consequences of your behavior. Okay, it's making the right decision. All of those are higher brain functions, and what happens over time is that your higher brain becomes impacted.
After 2 drinks, that frontal lobe starts to go. You know what you're doing, but it doesn't keep you away.
So for people in early recovery, it's important to remember that there's a sequence. You get triggered. The trigger leads to the thought of using, which will lead to the craving, which you can stop it here, but it's much more hard, which will typically lead to use. Because it often feels like it just suddenly happened. I was doing fine, and suddenly I was craving. A way to look at this that makes more sense is to see it go down. Yeah, because the trigger might be, external, okay? I've been sober for 3 weeks. I'm working really hard. I'm still having cravings, but I'm going to my meetings. I'm going to treatment. I'm talking to my counselor. I'm hanging in there. I'm not using, but it's really hard. And I just went down to the market to buy some milk, and who did I run into in the market?
Drug dealer.
My connection, my good friend. Immediately, I'm flooded with thoughts of using. Okay, the more rural your area is, the more likely these kind of things are to happen. And what might make it worse is that your dealer, your former dealer, might come over to you and say, "Hey, man, I haven't seen you in a while. You know what? I got some really good stuff last night. Come out to the car. I'll give you a taste." Probably not going to get through that situation with 3 weeks sober, and you're struggling every day to stay sober. So that's an example of how an external trigger can throw you off. What about an emotional trigger? Okay, same scenario. Guy's got 3 weeks sober, struggling, but he's doing okay, kind of, because he's still having cravings, but he's not using. He's going to his meetings. Gets into a huge fight with his wife. Gets really angry. Slams the door, runs out, and the first thing that pops into his mind is, "I need a drink. I need a line. I need to smoke a joint. I need to do this." Why is that the first thing that will pop into his mind at that point?
A lot of times you don't want to think anything, you don't want to feel anything, you don't want to think anything, and you know that works.
Okay, you want to know what my theory is?
What?
Because that's what happened for the last 5 years. He's become a black belt at using chemicals to squelch uncomfortable feelings. So that has become his default coping mechanism.
Default, yeah.
And our culture supports that. Because every
They say,
movie
"Oh,
you go
yeah."
to, a lot of TV shows, a lot of books you read, what do they show you? The guy gets into a fight, he gets fired from his job, what's the next scene? He's at the bar. We're acculturated in that way. So that's why, you know, the emotional trigger now can lead to this. So even though you know at this point, hey, you know, this is really dumb. What about my meeting? What am I going to tell Daryl and Sam and the rest of the group? What about my PO? What about the fact I'm getting tested? This is really dumb. It's too late. Usually by the time you're in that dialogue with yourself, in all likelihood you're going to use at that point. It's already gone too far. Even though you know on some level this is going to have a really bad outcome for me. So there's some techniques for thought stopping, because what you want to do is you want to stop that thought as soon as you recognize you have it. And you know, when I do the clinical work, these are different techniques that we give people. If it's someone who has a religious background, it might be praying, it might be visual imagery, it might be go to a meeting, call your sponsor, call someone. Usually, if you talk about the feelings, it dissipates them. None of these does the whole thing. You're still going to probably have to take some action.
What is snapping and what is urge and surfing?
Snapping is you wear a rubber band around your wrist. As you become aware of the thoughts, you snap the band and say no as you make yourself think about something else.
Oh, I need much more than a rubber band.
Right. So visual imagery, but try it sometimes. It might, you know, actually that one's been around since the 50s. It was started with Schick Scheidel smoking cessation.
Oh, really?
Clinics,
Hey,
yeah.
urge surfing.
Urge surfing is where you ride the urge until it peters out harmlessly on the beach. That's my reaction to it.
Okay.
We crash.
You say you give yourself 20 minutes and you be with that
For
feeling.
stimulant users, that one, in my opinion, my professional opinion, that one is very dangerous. Because your lower brain doesn't really care if you're going to wind up in jail or in a hospital or any place like that. But surprisingly, for alcohol, sometimes this one actually works pretty well.
Yeah,
So
28
really,
hours.
the point is that you want to talk about this in the group. You want to practice this so that you'll have. It's like having a tool. None of these will do the whole thing. You may still have to leave your environment, go to a meeting, go to the gym, do something, change it up in some way. Steve?
The picture of the prefrontal cortex not working. Okay? I mean, you know, that was imagery at its best, okay? It ain't working. The stop button is not there.
Correct.
Okay. So, this, you know, everybody's different, all the drugs are different. When does the prefrontal cortex start repairing, healing, functioning? Can it ever get back to normal? Obviously, with the memory in the amygdala, okay, it's always there. You know, we can say what we want, we can look great, talk great, but, you know, the brain scans don't lie. It lights up,
Right.
okay? So, can we, you know, use imagery to say, like, you know, somebody's coming out of jail. You know, been in there, I don't know, a couple weeks. And just show them, hey man, your stop button is not working. You need to go into treatment, long-term care, whatever. Or, you know, how long do these things last? I mean, do the brains repair themselves, or?
They absolutely do. You know, when you look at some of the, and by the way, you can get a lot of this stuff from NIDA. It's public domain because our tax money paid for it, so you can get fantastic stuff from NIDA and from SAMHSA. It's free to any American citizen. What they show is that the healing, again, it depends on the drug, it depends on how you used, for how long you used, whether you're male or female, what your genetics are. I mean, there's so many variables, it's hard to say.
Age?
Age is probably a factor. Late onset alcoholism resolves much better than most alcoholism starts in the teenage years. Most using starts in the teenage age. So when abuse and addiction start later in life, they usually resolve more easily. It's actually being called now pediatric disease because it always starts in the teenage or pre-teenage years.
So that's genetics.
Not necessarily. The scientists say, to the best of their knowledge today, 50% is genetic, and 50% they're not sure. So it's a combination of genetics and learned behavior. CBT model says pretty much it's all learned behavior, but I don't agree with that. I think genetics play a huge role.
And most studies show that.
Okay, so now we see, with young children, okay, the prefrontal cortex, the stop button, is not working. Like
Well, I'll tell you what makes it even worse. That's
with a
all-
2-year-old, that stop
It's
button.
there's a whole other lecture I do on adolescence, which is really scary because the age of using keeps going down all the time. Your cortex is not fully developed if you're a male until you're 24, 25. So you're impacting your brain that's not even developed yet, and we don't know what that's going to mean in the long run. And now we're seeing kids using at 10, 8, 11. Is it ever going to resolve in someone who starts using at 8? Or is it, we don't know. You can't do experiments. So,
How old is that older book you gave me, Steve? 90s?
Yeah.
Well, it's Miller and, what's his name, Blum,
Ken Blum.
and their references ADD, ADHD, genetic stuff.
it's a really interesting time now because the imaging technology is becoming so sophisticated now that it's virtually changing the whole field of addiction treatment. I mean, we're seeing huge changes come down the road, and we're just at the very beginning of that because we're starting to be able to see into the brain what craving is and what happens when someone, while they're using and all that kind of stuff. So, it's becoming, it is a very interesting field. Visual imagery is imagine a switch or lever in your mind. Imagine yourself switching it from on to off to stop drug thoughts. Have another image ready to replace the drug using or the alcohol using with. It should be something that is or was meaningful and or pleasurable to you that typically did not involve drug or alcohol use. When working with people that have been in the criminal justice system, I can't tell you how many have said to me, you know what I'll use? I'm not going to use a switch, Sam. I'm going to use the sound the jail door makes when it shuts. Because there's no other sound like that. That will be my cue.
Unique sound.
This is my last slide, so our timing is good, and we can talk a little bit about it if you want. This is Aldous Huxley wrote this in 1951 from The Doors of Perception. A firm conviction of the material reality of hell never prevented medieval Christians from doing what their ambition, lust, or covetousness suggested. Lung cancer, traffic accidents, and the millions of miserable and misery-creating alcoholics are facts even more certain than was in Dante's day the fact of the Inferno. But all such facts are remote and unsubstantial when compared with the near-felt fact of a craving here and now for release or sedation for a smoke or a drink. So I think Huxley nailed it in 51.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful paragraph.
I got that
Doors of
from
Perception.
one of the docs at UCLA years ago. I said, I'm going to steal that. I hope you don't mind. He says, that's fine. Okay, so there it is.
All right, thank you, yay.
Thank you.
Make some noise for the camera, yeah, all right. Hoorah.